Welcome to episode 14 of Ed's Not Dead. I'm Robbie Dodd. I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. C.H. Siddons.
Hey,
what's up, man? It's been a long time.
it's been too long. I thought you left the country.
I know. He's got deep-seated resentments against me. He's got like
You ghosted me.
It's like fear of abandonment.
You should see the text he sent me about you.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Oh,
I don't want
I had to delete them all.
He ghosted me.
God. And Mr. Peter Crable.
Hey,
Mr. Crabes. How are you?
Great.
Welcome back, everybody. It's been a while since we've recorded. We're glad to be back. We have a great show for you today. You can find us at Ed's Not Dead PC on Twitter. And Mr. Crabes, we have a sweet redesigned website, don't we?
In process, yeah.
Okay.
I think we're supposed to roll it out all at the same time.
Okay, so it's not quite ready yet?
I'm not sure. Yeah, a lot of it's ready.
Yeah?
You go look at it, sure.
Okay,
It looks good. I
Okay,
think it looks good.
It looks great.
Yeah.
New logo.
New logo,
New digs.
new color scheme, a little less dark and foreboding.
Do you have some lime in there?
There's some lime.
Yep.
There's
And
some
the coconut.
There's some pink.
Very good.
Yep.
I saw when you send out information on Gmail, Mr. Siddons always includes comments. Lots of comments. Lots of feedback.
I'm into comments. I like the comments.
I know he's the king of comments. I think he said his main comment about the new website was that the mobile version was
Which
poor,
is true.
was poor looking.
I don't understand, but you know.
Is that going to get better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, good. So, listeners, Mr. Crabes will give us the heads up when the website is ready to go. Mr. Sids, can our audience find us anywhere else? On
Facebook.
Facebook.
Until they shut it down before the 2020 election.
All right.
Is that where we're headed?
No.
Oh, okay.
It'll just ruin our democracy slowly.
I get a fair number of notifications
Notifications.
on Facebook that
Do you?
people are viewing or liking the Ed's Not Dead page.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's good.
Don't you get those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't get them for anything else, so yeah.
No, it's cool. Anyway, we got a great show tonight. We are going to be talking about content versus thinking skills, an age-old argument.
As old as time memorial.
Has come again. I'm going to be interested to see where Mr. Crable falls down on this, since he typically says that curriculum is not the answer and doesn't matter, right?
That's right.
So
Full circle.
So there's new thinking about it, and it seems like the educational pendulum is swinging back the other way, away from Common Core towards content. So we're going to talk about that. We are also very lucky to have author Richard Rothstein on the show.
Yes.
He's going to be talking about his book, The Color of Law, which I have sitting in front of me, which Casey, in his spare time, has lots of those little various...
Remember we discovered last time, that's his casual reading style.
Yeah, I mean, this is heavy stuff. And he's got, it's all annotated.
Yeah.
Were you did you have the content knowledge to read this book, or did you use your thinking skills?
I had to Google a lot of words.
You did. Okay, so your background knowledge and your vocabulary was limited. Is that right? We're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
I almost exclusively read on a Kindle now.
Yeah.
And
The word search stuff is so good.
the holding down on the word and the definition is amazing.
Okay,
It's great.
I don't have
And
any,
I'm not going to lie, sometimes I've been reading a couple paper books recently.
Yeah.
And I just want to be like, oh, I miss you so much.
Pushing the page.
I miss you, immediate gratification dictionary.
Do you read books on your iPhone? You use iBooks
no,
at all? I like
never.
iBooks on my phone.
The phone is...
It kills my eyes.
I can totally
just-
do the phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something about it, I don't know. I don't like it.
I haven't read many books this year. I'm kind of looking forward to summer.
Yeah.
So it's the end of the school year almost.
It is.
All you teachers out there, principals, parents, we know that you are very psyched. The pace of life is going to change. I'm looking forward to it. Are you guys?
Absolutely, yeah.
I love the summer.
Yeah.
Any
Just in general, I love the summer.
I do too. Yeah. This is May. Let's start with this.
Yeah.
What is the worst month of the school year for an educator?
February.
Yeah, it's like March, February.
Really?
You were going to say May?
I was going to say May.
Because it's right before June?
Yeah.
I love this time of the year.
I like May. Just because the weather's
Yeah.
good. I mean, as long as the weather's fine.
Yeah.
The February, March doldrums.
Yeah, the darkness
tough.
always gets
darkness.
Yep.
March, you're like, oh, we're turning the corner.
Yeah.
And then you don't.
You return in the corner and you walk outside and it's still freezing.
And then it snows. And you're like,
wind-
it's March.
It's windy and brutal. And
Why do I live here?
Spring break is still like 6 weeks away.
Yeah.
May has always been tough as a school leader. So many nights out. You know, Mr. Graves.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of end-of-year events.
Yeah, there's like this crescendo at the end that it's like a sprint and it can get pretty tiring.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's good. It's happy.
It is.
Yeah, it's a happy time.
It's a joyous, busy time.
Joyous. All right. Are you ready to get into our first segment?
Yes.
I totally lost it. There it is. So, the biggest education news story you've never heard of by Natalie Wexler, which essentially takes us back to the debate about content knowledge and how important it is versus thinking skills, quote unquote thinking skills. And I'm speaking very loosely here to describe these terms, right?
Yeah.
But certainly in the last decade, in the Common Core era, there was an emphasis on things like at the elementary level, focusing on kids making inferences, and at the middle school level, close reading. So how kids unpack text with those thinking processes in the brain. And this article talks about how students from disadvantaged backgrounds, a couple of the biggest things they lack are vocabulary and background knowledge, and those are actually more important than those thinking skills if they're going to be able to absorb heavy-duty content by the time they get to high school. Because when you think, if you get to high school and you're taking those AP courses, you really have to have the background knowledge to be able to survive in those courses, and you have to be able to handle really dense, complicated, complex text.
I always think about it as like immediately shelving information into different categories in your brain.
Yep. So this piece basically points out that in most elementary schools, there continues to be a real emphasis on explicit teaching of thinking skills.
Right.
That teachers spend a lot of time explicitly teaching how you make inferences, modeling those things for kids. And then the rigorousness of the text that the kids are in is not very rigorous, not very hard. And so then later on they can't handle the kinds of text that they're going to need to be successful in school or to, be competitive to get into college. So what is it, fellas? Is it content knowledge? Is content king? Or are thinking skills still the way to go? Or can we be mealy-mouthed and talk about combining the two?
Well,
how was that for a setup?
That was good. I'd like to applaud you. To not be mealy-mouthed and just to go on one side or the other. I was actually thinking recently, maybe it was because politics, elections, etc., and thinking about, and you and I, Robbie, have had this conversation off the air about social studies and what exactly social studies is. And so I was thinking about civics.
Socialist.
All right, anyway.
I got you. Yeah.
So, but I was thinking about sort of like civics is the example for this in terms of content versus skills. And civics in and of itself is really nothing but content. How does the government work? What are the branches of government? How old do you have to be president? All that sort of stuff.
NSL, national, state, and local government.
Right. And, I was thinking, I wonder if we do have a distinct lack of emphasis generally on content and specific things to know. There are things I think that are valuable to know. Now, being a robot and, I know the argument is, well, if you can look it up on Google, then why bother teaching it? And I mean, to a certain degree, I think that's true. But, the ability to quickly process and make connections and know things without having to look something up, there's an inherent value in that. So this piece in particular did strike a chord with me about, let's teach specific stuff.
But something like civics doesn't have to be content focused only. If you're looking at what age can you vote, you could look at you could have kids basically create an argumentative essay about or delve into the arguments for lowering the age to 16, which requires more skill-based instruction in terms of creating an argument, justifying your argument, and doing your own research on that kind of stuff. So I think my feeling on it is like there's always this feeling like it's got to be one or the other, but you can't just solely focus on skills because that's boring. And just focusing on content, then I think that's kind of boring too, because it's just you're not diving in, you're not close reading primary sources. You're not delving into the arguments behind the Federalist Papers. You're not going deeper into the content. You're just getting the content. So there has to be a mixture of both. And I also think there's a lot of misconceptions about skills-based instruction anyway. From when the Common Core was put into place, people thought it was only skills-based instruction. That's totally false. If you've actually read the Common Core standards, nowhere does it tell you that you need to focus only on skills. But there's a common misconception that Common Core was just that. We're getting rid of content. We're only focusing on skills, and that's completely false. And the tips they give for journalists, I think, here are sound, because journalists are focusing on the surface level, and they're not reporting directly on what they actually see in classes, and they're coming in and out really quick. And I don't think they're doing the education world a service.
And so they do talk about it. And Sonia Santelises is the chief executive officer for the Baltimore Public Schools, and it kind of, the article is through her in a sense. She also works with an organization called Chiefs for Change, head of school organizations that are kind of promoting more knowledge. And she says it doesn't take the place of other things, knowledge that is. But to say it's a side dish and to say content doesn't matter is professional malpractice. So let me ask you, just in anecdotal generalization, in going into schools and going into classrooms, would you characterize it as a deficit, as a lack of emphasis on content?
I don't think so. I think it's more of like, I think the problem that I see is that the focus on too much content, and rather than like trying to squeeze in thousands of years of history into one semester or 1 year, forces you to go a mile wide and an inch deep, and it totally takes away from the excitement that history can provoke in kids. So instead of spending an exorbitant amount of time and letting kids dive deeper into the various civil rights movement, not just African American civil rights, but gay rights and women's rights and all these other movements that came to place. Oh, well, we only have to we can only spend 3 days on it. So, then we have to go into the Vietnam War. And I just feel like it prevents teachers and students from diving deeper and gaining a true interest in the history.
But in a way, though, you're advocating for content. You're advocating for less content, but more depth.
Yeah.
So really, you're saying content is really important. You just don't want to include too much.
Right. Because if you have the even though it's less content, there's less. I think you have more of a chance for teachers to focus and build kids' capacity in focusing on the skills as well. Because if you're focusing on less content, it's not gonna seem like a whirlwind to kids about how much they're trying to digest on a single subject over a period of time, and you're focusing on the skills so that if they do take a class in the Vietnam War, even though they didn't study it in school, they're going to have the skills to read at an AP level course when they get there about the Vietnam War.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. I'm torn on this topic. You guys ever heard of E.D. Hirsch?
E.D. Hirsch.
Yeah, process versus content. He was the king on the content side at one time, and was kind of he was an anti-hero because he espoused content unapologetically in the late 80s, early 90s. And he was a professor at the University of Virginia. And I mean, I did not. I mean, he did push for national standards. He was an early proponent of national content standards for schools. But I spent a fair amount of time in my career in elementary classrooms. I taught in an elementary classroom, and when I was a principal, I do remember times where I would go into classrooms and teachers were doing book walks with kids on the carpet around the easel. This is before the days of smartboards. And the amount of explicit instruction on text features and modeling, and at a point I'd be like, okay, let the kids read.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Did you see the bold words here?
Yeah.
Did you see the italics?
Exactly. Let's go to the glossary. And the kids were not struggling with really rigorous text. And so I think that's part of the point here, is that there's, I think in education sometimes we swing one way or the other. I've always been, one of the things that came out of E.D. Hirsch's work was the standards of learning in Virginia, the SOLs. Mm-hmm. And in the 1990s, Maryland had the MISPAP, the Maryland School Performance Assessment Program, and Virginia had the SOLs. And the SOLs were very content heavy. I mean, they included geography, they included dates, they included events. And the MISPAP was all about process, all about how kids thought.
Right.
So it was kind of in standardized testing, it was the two extremes.
And that's what I was going to ask you is our resident historian.
Yes.
And token old guy.
Yeah, I know. Well, if you weren't going to say old guy, I knew that's what you were going to say. Yeah, right. Yeah, whatever.
Experienced hands, in other terms of the like. I mean, have you seen a dramatic and or obvious change away from content that's really discernible not only on the standardized test level, but also in the day-to-day classroom level that has really impacted how we teach kids? Because there's this idea of like, oh, we should change, content or thinking skills, and that's fine in theory, but if it doesn't really impact the classroom, then for me at least, it's a little bit of who cares?
Right.
But you have seen that.
I do think that, part of the process craze was associated with standardized testing. In other words, those things went together, at least in my experience. So standardized testing became a lot less about discrete knowledge and more about kind of, how you think. And so it wasn't so much about the text itself when you were reading it on a standardized test. It was what you could, what process or thinking skills you could apply to it. So yeah, I mean, I think content has become probably less important over the years. I think at the high school level, the secondary level, it still is important, and there's probably a disconnect between elementary instruction and secondary instruction, because the reality is that school systems don't have anything to do with College Board and AP courses. Those are developed completely outside of what school systems do in their curriculum. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a balance of both. I think both are important. I think it's one of those things that's become politicized also. It's like whole language versus phonics.
Sure. Yeah. I definitely thought of that too.
Yeah. So it's Edie Hirsch was considered a conservative thinker about education, just like Diane Ravitch was at one time. I mean, her book Left Back, her big first piece was was right along the lines of Edie Hirsch, which was we're teaching kids the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised at all. I think, I think we owe it to kids of all backgrounds to make sure that we give them rigorous content. I think it could be the slippery slope of low expectations if you don't do that. Because in this article, right, it says that kids come to school, there are differences with the amount of content knowledge and background knowledge they have.
And some will get it in school, and some won't get it in school.
So this article is saying we got to give it to them in school.
Right. Because if they don't get it here, they're not getting it anywhere else.
Right.
Now let me ask you a corollary question on that. So one of the things I've noticed with standardized testing, you were kind of bringing up some points about that. So it seems like nowadays every standardized test is essentially a reading test.
Mm-hmm. They are. You're exactly right.
And it didn't used to be that way.
No,
there used to be discrete content knowledge that was tested.
A long time ago. Okay. I mean, ever since
the early 90s?
Yeah, early 90s. It started to really change in the 90s. As I mentioned, the standardized
towards just the ability to dissect any text
Correct.
that you get, regardless of what you know.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and not just also reading skills, but also science skills. How kids on the MSPAP would use thinking skills that were not really science content knowledge. So it really swung pretty heavily in that direction. People thought when No Child Left Behind was passed that there would be more of an emphasis on content. I'm not sure there has been.
Yeah.
You've seen it in your time.
I mean, in like math, I would say, content is still pretty king.
It is king.
Yeah.
But you and I both know that what is one of the major accusations about middle schools? That they're too easy.
Yeah.
And where is that easiness coming from? I would argue that probably it's because middle schools are not as focused on content as maybe they should be. But I could be wrong about that.
No, I could. Yeah,
I mean, Project Success, which we've talked about endlessly on the show, was not really about content. It was more about community and culture.
Sure. And then building the other stuff in to be able to access it.
Correct. Yeah. Well, the third member of the show.
I think we're ready for our interview.
Are we ready for
Mr.
Rothstein?
Yes.
All right. Folks, don't go away. We'll be right back. We're excited to have Richard Rothstein on the show. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. I get to do my first opening ever for the podcast,
and you should be honored because it's for author Richard Rothstein.
I know. Well, everybody, we are so excited to have Mr. Richard Rothstein on the show tonight. We have a lot of awesome questions for him tonight. Richard Rothstein is a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Richard Rothstein is also the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. We welcome him. We are so excited to have him. Richard, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
So, unfortunately, your weather's not as nice as it is over by us, but hopefully we can brighten your day by some of the questions that we have for you, an exciting time that we're going to spend with you tonight. The first question we have, for folks who don't know about de jure segregation, tell us about the role de jure segregation has played in how it has impacted schools generally.
How it's impacted schools?
Yeah.
Well, that's a complicated question, but let me begin by saying that we had an education policy in this country in the 1990s and 2000, and it lingers on today, that claimed that the only reason we had an achievement gap between black and white children was because teachers in schools had low expectations for them. And if only we held those teachers in schools accountable for the children's test scores and tested them more, the achievement gap would disappear. And as you know, that idea, that theory was embodied in law in the No Child Left Behind Act. It was a bipartisan law adopted in 2001. Well, that theory was nonsense because the primary reason that we have an achievement gap between black and white children in school is because the social and economic disadvantages that children from low-income minority neighborhoods come to school with impedes their learning.
Right.
If a child has asthma and is up at night wheezing from that, and black children in urban areas have asthma at 4 times the rate of white children,
wow,
and they come to school drowsy and sleepless, the high expectations and more testing is not going to make them wide awake.
Yeah.
And there are so many of these conditions that children from low-income neighborhoods have. Asthma, lead poisoning, homelessness, economic insecurity, stress from living in a violent neighborhood or seeing police violence.
Yeah.
So all of these things contribute to the achievement gap. And then when you concentrate children with these disadvantages in single schools, closing the achievement gap becomes impossible. Well, schools are segregated today more than they have been at any time in the last 45 years, and it's getting more segregated over time. And the reason that they're segregated is the neighborhoods they're located in are segregated.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court has prohibited explicit school desegregation plans because the neighborhoods are segregated, it calls de facto, just by accident, by private prejudice, by private actors in the economy like real estate agents and banks discriminating, or people liking to live with each other of the same race, or maybe income differences. All of these individual personal decisions, they call it de facto segregation. And the Supreme Court has said that if you have de facto segregation, you're not permitted to do anything explicit about it. Well, the purpose of my book, The Color of Law, is to demonstrate that that's an utter myth. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. The residential segregation that we have in every metropolitan area in this country was created by racially explicit federal, state, and local policy. Of course, it built upon private prejudice, but the Constitution doesn't permit the government to build upon private prejudice. It requires the government to resist it.
Right.
And we call that system where the government embraces private prejudice and enforces violations of civil rights, explicit policies that assign where people may live based on their race. We call that de jure segregation. And unless we abolish the myth that the reason that we have segregation is by accident, because of private prejudice and private actions in the economy, that de facto segregation myth, and understand that racial segregation of neighborhoods and therefore of schools is as unconstitutional, as much a civil rights violation because it was created by government, as much as the segregation of lunch counters or buses or water fountains or schools or colleges and universities that we addressed in the 20th century. Unless we understand that, we're not going to be able to address it.
So, Richard, this is Robbie. I don't claim to be an expert on this topic, but help me out here. If there was, in response to Brown in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the school systems did make efforts across the country to actively desegregate, right? So is it safe to say that it's at some point, because school systems could say in courts that they were not actively segregating any more than the political will to continue to try to desegregate schools has disappeared over the last, you say, 40 years? Is that sound reasonable?
Well, yes, it's reasonable, and the position the schools took was reasonable. The schools weren't trying to segregate. The schools were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. And in order to desegregate schools, we've got to address the underlying cause. There's very little that schools can do. We can engage in busing again,
right?
But there's very little that schools can do to desegregate so long as they're located in segregated neighborhoods. Personally, I support the idea of neighborhood schools. All children should go to neighborhood schools, and they should be in integrated neighborhoods where they have opportunities to interact with children of other races, where they are mixed income. That's the way to desegregate schools. It's not by keeping segregated neighborhoods and trying to bus children long distances to schools in opposite race neighborhoods.
Right. I remember at one time, though, Richard, that the term neighborhood schools was really just kind of a proxy for Caucasian parents that wanted to resist desegregation. Do you remember those times? And isn't that correct?
Well, of course I remember that. They wanted to resist busing, taking children out of their neighborhoods in order to go to distant schools. You know, the whole basis of Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision that abolished legal segregation in school, was to permit children to go to their neighborhood schools. Linda Brown, the young woman, the child in Topeka, Kansas, whose father was the lead plaintiff in that case, lived in an integrated neighborhood. We had lots of integrated neighborhoods in the mid-20th century. We no longer have them today.
Yeah.
She wanted to go to her neighborhood school. She was forced to go to a school far from her neighborhood in order to keep her in a segregated school. Well, we no longer have neighborhood schools like that. And because we no longer have neighborhood schools and integrated neighborhoods, because there are very, very few integrated neighborhoods left.
Yeah.
So we need to address the underlying cause, which is neighborhood segregation. Housing policy is education policy.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot solve these problems of schools so long as we maintain segregated neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leads into my follow-up question in terms of proactive policies that maybe you promote or think that we should do. And I think that line that housing policy is education policy is a pretty powerful and sound one. So what should we be doing to create integrated neighborhoods and thereby integrated schools?
Well, there are many, many policies we should follow. I can go through a few of them, but the important thing to keep in mind is that we don't have the political will yet
mm-hmm.
to implement any of these policies. So policymakers know what we should do. It's no secret.
Yeah.
What we need is a new civil rights movement that's going to demand that we do it. So, for example, African-American families in the mid-20th century were excluded by explicit federal policy from participating in the suburbanization of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Housing administration subsidized white families only to move to single-family homes in all white suburbs. This was an explicit federal policy. The white families who moved, these were returning war veterans, working-class families who took advantage of these federal programs. The homes that they moved to with federal subsidy gained in value over the next couple of generations, appreciated. The white families gained equity. Those homes are no longer affordable to working-class families of either race. We ought to be subsidizing African Americans to purchase homes that otherwise are unaffordable to them at prices comparable to what they would have paid if they had been permitted to buy them at the point when whites were being subsidized to buy them. So that's one policy we could follow. We should be abolishing exclusionary zoning rules in suburbs that prohibit the construction of townhouses or even single-family homes on small lot sizes or multiple unit dwellings that maintain the prohibitions, those zoning laws, maintain segregation. We should prohibit those zoning laws, consider them unconstitutional because they perpetuate an unconstitutionally created situation.
Yep.
At the low end, we have programs that subsidize the housing for low-income families. One that many people are familiar with, the Section 8 voucher program. Another is a tax credit that's given to developers run by the Federal Treasury Department called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. Both of those programs perpetuate and reinforce segregation today because affordable housing for low-income families is placed primarily in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. The Treasury Department actually places a priority on the use of its tax credits in low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. It would be very easy to modify that program to require that a priority be placed in creating housing for low and moderate income families in neighborhoods that presently exclude them. We should be modifying the Section 8 voucher program, which also today perpetuates segregation because the way in which that program is designed ensures that most Section 8 voucher holders are going to have to use them in low-income segregated neighborhoods. Landlords won't accept them in high-opportunity places. That program should be modified as well. We should prohibit landlords from discriminating against Section 8 voucher holders. They're not prohibited from doing so now. A landlord can, under the law, refuse to accept a Section 8 voucher holder simply because they have a Section 8 voucher.
Yeah.
And the result is that in middle-class neighborhoods, landlords typically refuse to rent to families with Section 8 vouchers. So the only place they can be used is in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. So there are many, many policies that we could follow.
And as we know, I mean, like as you just referred to, there's not a political will to do that maybe at the federal or even state level. But one of the things that I found that really stuck out to me in your book and in the chapter about like looking at fixes was looking at curriculum and maybe the housing policy and all those other policies would not come to bear or will not come to bear anytime soon. But there's probably a lot of things that maybe local school systems can do or policymakers, education policymakers, that has to do with one of the things you quoted in the book. If young people are not taught an accurate account of how we came to be segregated, their generation will have little chance of doing a better job of desegregating than the previous ones. Mm-hmm. And we actually just talked about the difference between content and skills in classrooms. And you referenced the history book, The Americans: Reconstruction to the 21st Century. Can you talk to or speak to a little bit about what maybe local school systems could do, or boards of education or education policymakers that might be a little more maybe short-term fixes?
Absolutely. I'm involved with a number of people that are trying to stimulate civil rights activity around the issue of segregation. And one of the things we've done is we've created curriculum units that can be used in schools, high school curriculum in particular, to teach an accurate history of residential segregation. Mm-hmm. If you don't mind, I'll give you my email address, and any teachers who are interested in getting copies of these curriculum can send me a note, and I'll make sure to pass it on to the developers. It'll be ready this summer for teachers who are planning their courses for the coming school year. My email address is riroth@EPI, that's Edward Peter Ingrid for the Economic Policy Institute.org. That's riroth at epi.org. And if your listeners are teachers who are interested in pressing their schools or to adopt these curriculum or want to use it themselves in their own classrooms.
And I have a friend who actually did just that. He had his students look at local schools, and he had them look at the racial makeup of the different school district boundaries, and had his students in AP U.S. History dive into that and determine the extent to which there is segregation in his school district, which I found to be, the kids found to be incredibly not only engaging, but I think they were astounded to see what was in front of them.
Right.
So one last question for you, Richard, and it's going to be the broadest of them all. So in just thinking kind of how we got here and looking at some of the causes, I mean, does it come down to as simple of a haves versus have-nots and a me versus you sort of mentality and a racial, just the racial component that is
racism,
right? Yeah, that's in there. Is it just that simple?
Well, it's not haves and have-nots, because the have-nots have not primarily because of government policy.
Right.
It was the policy that created the have-nots, not the have-nots created the policy. And so if we had policies to redress this situation, we would be able to desegregate schools. Why did the federal government and state and local governments follow these policies? Well, they were the Democratic Party, let me say, in the 20th century was a segregationist party. It wasn't just the South.
Yep.
One of the stories I often tell, and if I can take a moment to tell this.
Sure, go ahead.
The Federal Civil Service was integrated in the early 20th century. It was an integrated federal civil service. And in 1912, when Woodrow Wilson was elected president, Wilson decided he was a Southerner, even though he had moved to New Jersey prior to becoming a president. He decided to segregate the federal civil service, and curtains were placed in federal office buildings. African Americans were fired if they supervised whites, because that was no longer permitted. Separate washing facilities were placed in basements for African Americans to use. But one of the biggest federal departments in 1913, when this program was implemented, was the Navy Department. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy at that time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who implemented the program of segregation of federal offices in the Navy Department.
Wow.
Now, I'm not suggesting that Roosevelt's had this idea himself, or that I don't know if he even liked it, but he certainly went along with it. It was part of the assumptions of the Democratic Party in which he thrived, in which he matured. And when he became president, race issues were not a priority concern for him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He was willing to sacrifice them in favor of any more aggressive policy on economics or fighting the war. It wasn't just a compromise with Southerners. This was the assumption of his administration, Northerners and Southerners alike.
Yeah.
He certainly didn't care as much as his wife did.
Well, that's right. This was not a program of segregation without controversy. His wife was the leading opponent of his policies of segregation.
Interesting. Yeah, this is so. We're as educators, it's challenging for us. One of the things that I want to get your thoughts on right before we say goodbye, and this has been great, is if you want to create a ruckus in a public school system, you mention two words: boundary study. And school systems are still trying to find ways to it sounds like, based on what you're saying, try to address a problem that they didn't necessarily create. Do you think that there are any more effective strategies that school systems can use to try to integrate or desegregate that haven't been used aside from busing?
Well,
magnet programs.
Magnet schools,
yeah,
busing. But as I said again, and I know it's not easy to get your head around this, but housing policy is education policy,
right?
And if we want to desegregate schools, there's very little we can do unless we address the segregation of housing.
Yep.
So many African American, disadvantaged African American children live so far from affluent white communities, and vice versa, that no matter how much we fiddle around with attendance boundary zones and how much we fiddle around, but of course we don't do it anymore with busing or with magnet schools, we're not going to do very much. We should do those things, but we're not going to do very much to desegregate schools unless we confront the fact that it's housing segregation that creates the segregation of schools.
Jeez.
All right. Well, the book is incredible. It's The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, by our guest, Richard Rothstein. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the show. Give us that email address one more time and any other way that our listeners can contact you.
Sure. Well, email is the best way. It's riroth@epi.org. And I look forward to hearing from them.
All right, Richard. Thanks. We'll catch up with you soon. We appreciate you coming on Ed's Not Dead.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care. Thanks again to Richard Rothstein. That was an incredible interview.
It was.
I think I said off the air that I was stretched to the limits of my IQ when he was talking about housing policy. Yeah.
Was that on the air or off the air?
That was on the air.
Was it on the air?
No, it was off the air.
Okay,
I think it was off the air.
All right.
Anyway,
well, now it's on the air.
The housing policy is education policy is powerful and something that I kind of know that, but the way his argument was, okay, that's true.
And and again, that line in particular, I think, is really going to stick with me. And I've had conversations about some of the stuff where you think something seems unfair or unequal or off, but you don't know why. You don't have the history. You don't have the facts. You don't have the information. But some of the housing decisions, the de facto and de jure segregation, advocated by the federal government,
and directed by that.
Is it safe to say the three of us grew up in undiverse neighborhoods?
Incredibly undiverse.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've experienced it and without even knowing we were experiencing. Well, maybe we knew it, but
at the time I didn't know it.
No, I don't think.
At some point,
I don't think I.
Where I grew up, it wasn't like there was no diversity anywhere. And you even marginally close.
But what about in a small town? Was there the other side of the tracks? Did you have the proverbial train running through town?
I mean, it was maybe economically diverse, but not racially.
All right.
I mean,
so you had white working class or white poor?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And I feel like we talked about this earlier, but the social woes of our country are often put on the shoulders of school leaders and teachers and administrators and policymakers, when it's not just our responsibility, it's the responsibility of something as big and large a ship as federal housing policy. Mm-hmm. Something that you wouldn't inherently think would change the opportunity gaps that kids have in schools, but it really does have an impact.
And it was, as he pointed out, it was, to steal the key line from Brown, deliberate. It was deliberately racist and
it had a purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The only thing that I didn't ask him that I never want to let the private sector off the hook so easily. Yeah. And he talked a lot about the way government has created segregation in housing policies, but I didn't. He mentioned a little bit about mortgages and lending, but certainly the private sector's had a role.
They certainly have it, and in his book, and he notes that in the book where it's like I can talk all day long about the ways in which real estate companies and banks legitimately, or not legitimately, but actually segregated and made policies for their own companies to not provide services to people of color. But his book was just focusing on the non-talked about area of government policy, regulations, and things that policymakers and bureaucrats did to block African Americans specifically from neighborhoods. And
well, that's what he's an expert on.
Yeah.
I was impressed with your Eleanor Roosevelt knowledge.
Oh, you were?
Yeah.
Well, my dad is 90, and my dad was I guess he was a big FDR fan. He grew up during the Depression.
Yeah.
And so...
What year was he? So,
28.
Okay.
28. Yeah, I mean,
he was
a little kid in the
Yeah.
height of the Depression. I mean, he remembers food rationing and all those kinds of things. Yeah. So, and he was a big Eleanor Roosevelt fan. I mean,
she was popular well into the 50s, right? When did she die?
I don't know that. I don't know that. I know that, as far as government is concerned, and as far as being a first lady, she was way ahead of her time.
Yeah.
She was obviously more qualified than her husband.
1962.
Yeah. Really? She
Yep.
lived that long?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So she died. She died during the Kennedy administration.
Yeah.
The only thing last thing I'll say is that didn't either of you have that little twinge of, I mean, you can't let schools off the hook altogether? I mean, I just felt like, he did say at one point that the closing the achievement gap was impossible. He used the word impossible. And I've never operated in that.
Maybe I'll go back and listen. I thought he backed away from that a little after he said impossible, but
yeah. So I mean, I don't, because education and schools have certainly played a huge role in perpetuating organizational structures, and I mean, schools are typically a reflection of society. So even post Brown, up until this day, schools have a tremendous amount of work to do on this, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to let schools off the hook, and I don't want to say impossible, but I mean, do we have a lot of heavily segregated schools that, have done well and broken the mold? What do we have more of? Schools that have broken the mold, or schools that have fallen victim to the mold, or whatever analogy you want to use?
Yeah, I mean, I think schools are struggling with it. They're trying to. I mean, schools have taken on the achievement gap, but I think to his point, he talks a lot about opportunity, and I think maybe schools are switching their focus towards opportunity, institutional barriers. I mean, that's what all these policies he's talking about. They created barriers. They blocked people from access and opportunity.
Right. Accessing the upward levers of mobility.
Correct. And schools have done the same thing, from the courses that you can take to the teachers that you can have, the programs you can access. All right. Well, thanks again to Richard Rothstein. He was a tremendous guest.
Yeah.
All right. So when our audience hears this, it is May. School's almost over.
It is.
I can't wait.
It's almost Memorial Day.
I know. It's almost Memorial Day.
See, when this comes out, it'll be a week from today.
All right. So any plans Memorial Day?
I'm flying to Asheville.
Whoa.
I'm taking my first personal day in 3 years.
No, you really?
Okay.
Seriously.
All right. I'm not going to comment on
Why?
that. I'm not going to say
Yeah,
a
me
word.
too.
Why? Yeah.
I've not taken any ever. What?
Woo.
I've never taken a day off. What do you mean? What are you doing in Nashville?
My younger brother moved there.
Oh, I forgot you told me.
He picked up and moved.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very nice.
Got a job with GE.
Do you know Asheville is on my list of places to move?
Really?
That I've never been to.
Well,
Really?
I'll,
You never
I'll
been there?
report
I've
back.
never been
I'll
there.
report back.
Yeah.
I went to, when I was 10, I went to National Wildlife Camp.
No.
Yes. For 2 weeks.
How many
for
snakes
14
did you
days.
hold?
I held a lot of snakes, and I caught my first lizard.
Ah.
I was obsessed with catching a lizard, because you can't find lizards in Maryland very readily, especially now with all the development. But anyway.
Ranger Rick? Was it Ranger
It
Rick?
was Ranger Rick. It was through Ranger Rick. Yeah. The brochure came from, my mom saw it in Ranger
Yeah.
Rick. I was a Ranger Rick. My grandmother got me Ranger Rick. It's a subscription. I had it for years.
Casey, did you know about Robbie's love of reptiles?
I did.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe our audience doesn't know.
I wanted
Yeah.
to, I wanted to be a herpetologist
Yeah.
when I was
You
growing
have-
up.
Years ago, we were walking somewhere, and there was like a little garden snake.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like a pencil.
Okay,
but I was
first of
like,
all-
ah!
First of all, he did the dead giveaway. He called it a garden snake.
Oh no,
Versus a garter snake.
garter snake.
Garter.
I thought it was Gartner.
Oh, it's a garden snake.
It's a Gartner snake.
It's a kindergartner snake.
Anyway,
So Robbie just picks it up, and he's just like, totally fascinated. I'm just like, what is wrong with you?
Who is this person?
yeah, that was one of the highlights of my classroom when I was a teacher, is all the reptiles I had. But anyway, so National Wildlife Camp was in Hendersonville, which is right outside Asheville, right at the base of the Smokies. Mm-hmm. Hendersonville and Asheville are awesome places. You're going to love it.
I'm excited.
Lots of great art galleries there. Yep. It's a pretty cool place.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Good fly fishing.
A lot of breweries.
I know. Well, you're a millennial.
Got to check out all the hipster breweries.
All right, what are you doing? Are you in parenting purgatory during Memorial Day weekend?
I think it's just called parenting. Actually, Pearl's turning 1.
Oh, yeah. Pearl.
On the 27th, so actually on Memorial Day.
Big Pearl.
Yes. Well, she's miniature human being, but yes.
Miniature.
Beautiful miniature human
Beautiful
being.
miniature. So we're having some people over. I guess you could call it a party, whatever you want, but it's mostly just for the adults. And
nice.
We're getting a very, very fancy cheese plate.
Okay. Yeah. You guys are going all out.
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah, spending some money on a cheese plate because we went to this party and it was an 8-foot long cheese spread.
Cheese is so good.
And I just sat there for
Wow.
like 45 minutes. And, you kind of pretend like you're not just sitting there totally bogarting all the cheese. But you really are. And so we're getting a much, much smaller version.
There's nothing better than sharp cheddar cheese. And it makes you so fat.
Do you like,
I love it.
do you like blue cheese?
Oh, what do you mean? I'm
just
the
making
king
sure.
of blue cheese.
Because the only thing better than a nice sharp cheddar
is
a nice blue.
I agree. I'm with you.
I love a nice stinky blue.
I hate blue cheese.
Oh,
really?
It's so good. Blue cheese is my favorite.
My wife bought me some really stinky blue cheese from the place where we're getting it from.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, it's so good. And then I really started to look at it. And I was like, it's not a good idea.
No,
you don't want to look too closely.
Pretty disgusting.
Yeah.
But it smells really good and it tastes really
It
good.
tastes amazing.
And
you?
it's the pool opens. I'll be
yes.
standing on the deck for the first swim team practice. My I know. It's
Your daughter's doing it?
Yeah,
Doing it.
no, both Johnny and Nora. Yeah, so that's the tradition. That Saturday morning, there's no rest for the weary. You get up Saturday morning, and there you are on the pool deck watching the first practice, and the summer
I'll
starts.
show up at the pool at about noon.
Yeah, are you going to come
on Saturday?
Yeah,
it didn't even cross my mind. I don't know.
Yeah, the pool will be open.
Maybe.
Okay. All right, well, folks, thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Richard Rothstein for being our guest on Ed's Not Dead. Spread the word, everybody. This will air. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Monday the 20th.
20th?
Yes.
Okay. The audience knows my issues with our episodes and how they all the pieces fit together.
They all bleed together.
Please follow us at Ed's Not Dead PC. Check us out on Facebook. Check out the new and improved website at some point when Crable finishes it. And tell your friends about the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. Later.